Let's talk quickly about this Princeton autism study. I think we all understand that autism is very heterogeneous, both genetically, developmentally, behaviorally, and we've probably all heard the saying that if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. What these researchers did was use advanced modeling on a large group of autistic children's data, 5,392 kids, from the SPARK cohort. And they basically were using these different modeling techniques to see if any specific subgroups or patterns would emerge. You can kind of think of it like when roommates are assigned to dorms for college kids. So imagine that you had the task of assigning roommates to college dorms. Instead of sorting all of these students by just one trait, like their normal bedtime, what time they choose to go to bed, then you would look at dozens of traits, like look at their study style, maybe music preferences, their social needs, their sensory sensitivities, and you use these modeling techniques to see if you can find natural clusters of those traits that are going to live well together. That's kind of the best analogy I can think of with this data. It's very early, so hopefully that makes sense. They didn't know when they started this how many groups were going to make the most sense. They tried the model with anywhere from groups of 2 to groups of 10. So basically with 2 groups, you get the extremes and you miss the nuances and you miss all of the gradients, if you will, of presentations in between. And then with the larger number of groups, with 10 groups, you have so much nuance built into it that actually the groups start to all just kind of look alike. So it turned out that 4 classes was the best fit for the data that they had. I made this chart to hopefully sort of summarize what they found. Basically, they looked at 239 phenotype features in the categories that you see at the top of the page. Those are just kind of typical categories across autism research. The 4 groups that they found, they called broadly affected. That was 10% of the cohort. Then there was moderate challenges, which was 34% of the cohort. Social/behavioral, which was 37% of the cohort. And then mixed autism spectrum disorder with developmental delay, and that was 19% of the cohort. So this was based on the SPARK cohort, which has over 5,000 kids in it, ages 4 to 18. Couple of things that I wanted to point out. There were 2 groups where they noticed a significant amount of developmental delays. That was the broadly affected group and the mixed with developmental delay group. The moderate challenges group and the social/behavioral group did not have significant developmental delays. So kids that basically looked like they were developing on a typical timeline, typical milestones being hit, such as walking, talking, things like that. There were also 2 groups that had significant amounts of co-occurring conditions like ADHD, anxiety, depression, and in one of those groups, the social/behavioral group, they also found a higher incidence of genetic traits that are linked to those sorts of conditions. After the researchers had done the initial modeling that showed them that 4 groups was the best fit, they also started looking at genetic data. So I also included a little bit of that info on here as well. You'll notice that there were a lot of de novo or new mutations. If you're not sure what that is, basically de novo mutations are mutations that you did not inherit. They are new to you. However, in the mixed autism with developmental delay group, there was both high impact de novo mutations and a lot of rare inherited variants. And so this might suggest that there's a stronger inherited component specifically for that group compared to the other 3. In the moderate challenges group, they basically scored lower than the other groups on most of the categories. The de novo mutations that were found there were typically in genes that are less critical during early brain development. Of course, as with any study, there are some limitations. One very significant one that I think needs to be pointed out is that there is a pretty big lack of diversity in this cohort. So the SPARK cohort, if I recall correctly, is something like 80% white. So we don't know yet how this sort of model is going to look with more data and more specifically more diverse data. It also relied a lot on self-reported data, particularly from parents. And this study is basically a cross-section. You're kind of looking at the data for all of these kids at one point in time rather than in a longitudinal sense. And we know that autism presentation can, of course, change over time, particularly with respect to acquiring language skills, motor skills, and of course, kids that may not have anxiety or depression when this was looked at could, of course, develop that later on. After using the SPARK cohort to run these models and come up with these 4 groups and do the genetic analyses, the researchers also did the same tests On a separate cohort, the SSC, which is the Simon's Simplex Collection, it is a smaller sample, so the power is less, but they did say that it validated the 4 groups. Other than the study being interesting, it doesn't really mean anything for anybody specifically right now at this point in time. This doesn't mean that the DSM is going to change tomorrow. It doesn't mean that you need to rush out and go get some sort of test or genetic test done to be put into a subgroup. This is just one step in the research, one paper. Again, very interesting one that will probably be built upon, but as of right now today, it doesn't really change anything for you or your children or your loved ones specifically.